Um, Thank you. Thank you very much. I actually have some slides. I feel a little bit out of place. Here we are. Okay, so those are my slides. I see the translation is cutting off the top, but that's okay. It's not the end of the world. I'm being a little bit provocative, of course, with this copy of the tweet that I have it's from Omar Sulema in New Orleans in the United States. All right, he's in Texas. So what I'm going to be talking about is how international law and institutions have been used really as colonial tools, and how they have not been used, or they have not functioned to protect the rights of Palestinians like we hope they would and we hope they should. There's some way of doing this. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Great. It works. So just the three main points that I want to talk about, I want to touch on today, is the first one, very uncontroversial, I'm sure, at least for the people here in this room today, that the international community really has never adequately protected Palestinian rights in any kind of serious way. Again, I think I'm preaching to the converted here in this room on that point. The international human rights stuff that is going on has been going on for decades, and in particular over the past 2 years. Everything, I'm sorry for these acronyms, everything in the Human Rights Council, the special rapporteurs, the commissions of inquiry, the cases in front of the International Court of Justice, the arrest warrants by the International Criminal Court, and the investigations, all of these things, they are important. I don't mean to belittle them, and I don't mean to say that we should just stop using them and not have anything to do with them. They are very important in advancing the Palestinian cause, but it's important also to recognize and to remember that they are all based on the Oslo framework. They are based on the failed two-state idea. So that's something that we always have to keep in mind. We mustn't be starry-eyed about them or about the prospects for advancing what we really want to do in the UN or in international institutions right now. We have to keep, I believe we have to keep on using them strategically. It's important to keep on using international law and the institutions that we have now to further the Palestinian cause. But we need to look beyond them as well. The current institutions are they're very colonial, they're very Eurocentric in many ways, and I'll touch on that as much as I can today. So we have to understand that, and we have to be mindful of that as we are using them in our campaigns. These maps, we all use these maps. We all know exactly what they are, and I know that we all use them in our individual activism, in our talks and all the things. So I don't have to go over what they are, but they are very important. I mean, every time I do any kind of talk on Palestine, every class that I do on Palestine, I always come back to these maps because they are so blatantly obvious. And I'll get to them, I'll get to the partition resolution and everything, but it's just so obvious, aside from the really die-hard, committed pro-Zionist people. Anybody with an open mind, you see these maps, and you say, how can this be? How can this be presented as anything near a just solution? How can it be a just solution in any meaning of the word? It's just so blatantly obvious that I always like coming back to these maps. I always think it's really important. So international law in general, and it's important to, not to be starry-eyed about this. International law has a history of racialized hierarchies. For centuries, it was used as a tool of imperialism by the imperialist powers. And this, it was used to justify the civilizing mission, to justify colonialism, all of these things. We don't, I could talk about that for 90 minutes. We don't have the time to really dwell on that. But it's important to be, it's important to be mindful of that history. And many of those very colonial, very Eurocentric traditions remain. It's only been really over the past 20 years or so that legal scholars have been talking about this and have been pointing to these histories and talking about the colonial origins of international law. Zionism, of course, again, I don't have to dwell on this because everybody knows this. Settler colonial movement. And this was, it was expressed in very, very open terms by the early Zionists. We're going to take over that land. The natives should be happy about it. They should be thankful. We are bringing European civilization. And if they're not thankful enough, we'll just kick them off the land. Again, international law at the time, under international law, the non-civilized, the non-European races, they really had no sovereignty. They were not recognized as having title over their land. The white men came, and it was their right to use the land and the resources for their capitalist development. And the natives, they just had to put up or shut up. It was just how it was. I'm not defending the early Zionists, of course. I'm just saying that was the idea here. These people were of that class, European class at the time, and this is how they thought of the whole thing. I have a quote from our friend Balfour there, just very, very blatantly, openly saying, look, we're not going to, this was after the declaration, by the way. I believe it was 1919 in a letter to the prime minister, but, very openly expressing why self-determination and why are we going to consult the natives, the savages? What's that about? I mean, why are we even going to bother doing that? I mean, there's no point in that. So, this was very much the attitude. This was very much how they looked at things at the time. Again, I'm sorry the top line is being cut off, but self-determination became a thing after World War I, really. It was the American President Wilson who advocated self-determination as a principle to be abided by in international relations. It's very important to understand that at the time, it was not looked upon as a right. It was not like a God-given right, for lack of a better word, that all peoples had. Rather, it was looked upon as a political principle. So it was something that, when the powerful countries, when the imperialist countries wanted to, when they saw it as expedient, maybe we'll think about self-determination. But it was not something that all peoples just had inherently. The other thing is that I wrote here, non-white peoples need not apply. Whether that was really Wilson's attitude himself or whether it was sabotaged by the Brits and the French, historians have different interpretations about this, but certainly that's how it panned out in the end. Self-determination was looked upon as something for, again, civilized peoples, basically the old Balkans colonies in Eastern Europe. And, Asia, Africa, come on. I mean, this is not, self-determination. This is for civilized people. It's not for savages. It's not for, it's not for brown-skinned people, of course. So that was the whole idea. And, a very stark example of that, or that's, starkly exhibited in the League of Nations mandates. And, you just look at the Covenant of the League of Nations, Article 22 this is about the mandates, and it talks about how the people of the former colonies of the losing powers, so the Ottomans and the Germans, they were not able to stand on their own 2 feet in the strenuous conditions of modern life. I can't remember the exact language, something like that. It's pretty close, yeah. So, that's why they had to be administered and tutored by the British and the French. That's sort of how it worked. Still, the mandates were ostensibly aimed at independence. It was, it was very vague, and it was at some kind of undefined point in the future. But the idea was that these countries would be led towards independence by the Brits and the French. But the Palestine Mandate, again, it was an exception. And here starts what I call the Palestinian exception to self-determination in the eyes of the imperialist powers. Because the Palestine Mandate explicitly incorporated the Balfour Declaration. So the other countries, the other former colonies of the Ottomans and the Germans, they were to be led into independence. And it did happen in a few occasions. That was the idea of the mandates. But with the Palestine Mandate, no, I mean, this was just never going to happen. The Palestine Mandate was going to be administered by the Brits with a view towards creating the Jewish national home in light of the Balfour Declaration. That was very clear. So again, Palestine was separate. Palestinians had even fewer rights than the rest of the people. Then the 47 partition resolution comes along, and again, these maps come into play. And we all know what these maps are. I don't have to dwell on them in great detail, but it's important to look at them and sort of refresh our anger at what this is all about. The map on the left is what Palestine looked like at the time, right? So 94% of the land belonged to Palestinians. 2/3 to 70% of the population or so was also Palestinian. And yet, the really smart 100-year-old men in the United Nations, the so-called international community, the middle map was their great idea of a solution to the problem, right? So it's like, okay, Palestinian people, so what? We'll just give, you'll just give over half of your land, over half of your country, to these European colonizers, just because this is a great idea. This is gonna work just fine, right? So it was clearly ridiculous, not only in the sense of practicalities, but you just look at these maps. I use these maps all the time. I mean, in my classes, like in Japan, when I was doing my classes, and I'm talking about people who really know very little, like the Japanese students in general knew very little about Palestine. And you show them these maps, and they're like horrified. And they're like, how did this happen? I mean, come on. I mean, who is going to look at this and say this is right? Who is going to look at this and say this is just? So these maps are really important. How did this happen? So you look at the UN at the time, the membership of the UN at the time, we're looking at 57 member states, right? Over half of the world remained under Western colonialism. So they were not independent yet. They did not have seats around the table. Their voices were not reflected in any serious way, shape, or form. So, this is how it happened. I mean, in the current GA, this would not happen, I guarantee you. One country, one vote. This was, this kind of blatant example of colonialism and Western imperialism, recognition of this kind of settler colonialism. It's hard to imagine this happening now. But that's just, that was the lay of the land at the time. And then, of course, the Nakba, the newly created state of Israel is refusing to allow the refugees to return, and yet it's still admitted to the UN, still admitted to the Western nations club, the imperialist club here is how it was at the time. And of course, then we look at 67, and the framing really gets much more stark as a belligerent occupation. Somebody said this I think maybe it was yesterday. Oh, no, you said it, actually, I think just now, about the word occupation and how it's framed as an occupation, which is, of course, problematic. Occupation being something which has to end very quickly, but it's not looked upon as what it really is, a situation of colonization, not just of 67, but of the entire land of Palestine. So the Oslo. Then we get into Oslo, and once again we have the Palestinian exception to self-determination. Self-determination by this point is really a big thing. It's recognized as a human right, right? So in the 1919 and also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, self-determination was not a human right. It was still something which strong countries might want to allow if it was expedient and if it was convenient. But by this point, after the period of decolonization in the world, you had all these newly independent states coming around the table, and their voices were reflected in the creation of and development of international law. So self-determination was recognized as an inalienable right and a right of all peoples. Whether this was recognized in practice is a different question, but at least it was recognized in the letter of the law. But we look to see what happened in practice with Oslo, to gain a seat at the table, to be recognized as a legitimate representative. The PLO made all these concessions. The PLO basically abandoned their claim to all of the land of Palestine, abandoning their claim to self-determination as encompassing all of Palestinian land. Again, you all know this. This is not something that I'm not saying anything new to these people, to you people, but it's important to remember that. And this is the fundamental basis. Again, the basis here. So the two-state solution, having been given already its sort of legal underpinning in the partition resolution. And in Oslo now the countries of the UN can conveniently come up and say, oh, well, the Palestinians themselves have recognized this. The Palestinians themselves are accepting that their country, they will move towards an independent state, but only on 22% of what was originally their country. This gets conveniently forgotten, right? No, when the UN, when the so-called international community talks about the independent, the independent state of Palestine, which shall be realized, inshallah, at some point in the future, they're always only talking about this 22%. This is, this is the fundamental issue here. Yeah, and the siege of Gaza and all this kind of thing, which I really don't think I have too much time to talk about. But so even in the middle of this overt genocide, the slow-moving genocide, of course, has been continuing since at least 47, if not earlier. But even in the midst of this overt genocide and the mass massacres which have been taking place, Palestinian self-determination, it's cut off in the top line of the slide again, but Palestinian self-determination is continuously being looked upon as conditional. It's being looked upon as being good boys and girls and accepting the state of Israel, accepting that 78% of their land now belongs to somebody else, accepting that only nonviolent means will be used to further the aims of an independent Palestinian state. All of these things, no other peoples have been forced to accept these conditions in the pursuit of their self-determination. It really is exceptional how the Palestinian people have been forced to concession after concession after concession. So what's been going on, and of course everybody here has been following the news and what's been going on with the International Court of Justice, the arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court, the reports by Francesca, the Special Rapporteur on Palestine. All of these are really important. I don't mean to belittle them. I don't mean to say that we should scoff at them and that we should not use them. It is important that we continue using them. And of course, many of the people who are working on these, Francesca and all the other people, they are our allies for sure. But at the same time, we mustn't get too starry-eyed about this. They are all based on the two-state solution, every one of them. The International Court of Justice has they've stated on many occasions that the Palestinian right to self-determination is an inalienable right. Israel is wrong for preventing its realization. It's stated in black and white. That's very important. But at the same time, in the same breath, they also explicitly recognize that the Palestinian right of self-determination only extends to 67. For the 48 territories are now the independent state of Israel, recognized by the United Nations. It doesn't count. So it's important to understand that. It's important to understand that this is the limit, one of the limitations, one of the big limitations of the UN as we have now. The day after discussions that has started already, I would say on 8th of October 2023, Palestinians being completely excluded from these discussions, of course. The exclusion of Hamas, of course, a complete given from the get-go. The Trump colonization plan, again, very, very overt in its intention to continue on with controlling Palestine and colonizing Palestinian land. The question of self-determination doesn't even feature, and yet this is being discussed in serious ways right now in the hallways of the UN. Maybe some of the more overt things will be, left out. The terms of what the International Stabilization Force, quote unquote, is going to be doing. This is still under discussion and open to negotiation as far as we know. But the starting point is always, the two-state solution. The starting point is always the two-state solution is the only way, only feasible and just solution for peace in the Middle East. Blah 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 blah. We've heard this. We've heard this, ad nauseum. So it's really important to, keep a focus on what we really want to achieve and what the truly just solution will be. And it's very frightening to think that the UN once again will be rubber stamping this colonization plan that is being discussed right now. So, the international law, international institutions, once again, just to repeat, they are important. It's important to use them strategically. It is important to continue furthering them, using them to further our goals and the goals of Palestinian liberation. But they can't be an end upon themselves. Just a few thoughts about what we really want to achieve. The double standards, of course, the blatant hypocrisy in international relations and in international institutions. Of course, it has to end. Impunity for Israel has to end. I've argued in some of my papers that Israel really must be expelled from the UN. What will happen to the UN after that? It's an open question. Will Trump kick over the bin and storm out and kick the UN out of New York? Maybe, but maybe that's what needs to happen. It's difficult to say. When we look at the United Nations, and people are often talking about the double standards and how these institutions, or how the UN as an institution maintains the structure of colonialism and these double standards, people often look at the Security Council, and people are often talking about the Security Council and how it is the P5, the permanent 5 members, have a stranglehold over what the Security Council can do. And that is true. That's very important. But it goes much, much deeper than that, unfortunately. The lack of stable funding for the United Nations means that rich countries have huge sway over what the UN can do. And I say this as a former senior UN official. When there is a humanitarian emergency, whatever you want to call a humanitarian emergency, when something which had not been planned for takes place, when large number of refugees cross the border of a country, this is something which is not planned for, and it is not in the UN budget. So that means the UN goes around with a tin can saying, please, could you fund this? Please, could you do that? Now, when we have to go for what we call voluntary contributions or extra budgetary funds, we're not going to Bangladesh or Sierra Leone. We're not going to do this. We're going to go to countries like, well, not the United States anymore, but we'll be going to the quote-unquote traditional donor countries of Western Europe, Japan. These are the countries that we're going to be going for to ask for DASH. And I can tell you that these rich countries will quite often say, yeah, we'll be interested in funding you, but maybe you want to think about sort of tempering A, B, and C. Well, yeah, okay, we're happy to fund this project, but it seems like it's a little bit overly critical of Israel. For example, this is just an example. So maybe you want to sort of temper down that kind of thing, and maybe we'll think about it. This is how it is, and the international system is made to allow that. Unfortunately, well, it evolved to allow that. Let's put it that way. One of the goals, I believe, must be to make international institutions more representative, not only representative in the sense of which countries are around the table, but also why is it that only governments, why is it only the political elite of each country that is around the table and making these decisions for us? Because as we have seen, many of the political elites of our countries do not represent the views of the people. And this is something that really needs to be thought about and really needs to be changed. As a long-term goal, well, I say long-term, but maybe it's not so long-term. I am old enough to remember the Berlin Wall, and when the Berlin Wall came down, I can tell you nobody saw this. Nobody saw this coming, and it was very dramatic and it was very quick. It was very fast. So inshallah, maybe something will happen very quickly here. We can only hope. So thank you very much.